T-SQL Architecture with Erik Darling.
The AI DevOps podcast is a show for those shipping software using AI, .NET, Azure, and DevOps. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods and sharing success stories. Sponsoring the podcast is ClearMeasure, a software architecture and engineering firm that implements AI to empower software teams to establish quality, achieve stability, and increase speed. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that AI, Azure, and the .NET ecosystem has to offer. My returning guest today on the show is Erik Darling, was last on the show in episode 315, talking about database technical debt. Erik makes your databases faster in exchange for money, effectively. He's a DBA developer and architect with a track record of tackling even the most challenging of technical issues. He runs a SQL Server consulting and coaching practice. In addition to his consulting services, he's also passionate about blogging and training and contributing to open source projects that help with SQL Server's troubleshooting and using SQL Server better in general. And he's given many public speaking presentations, and he schedules speaking engagements very, very frequently on topics at conferences and events around the world, like PASS Summit and SQLBits and various Redgate conferences, among others. So, Erik, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm very good, man. That was a great introduction. I almost got a little emotional.
Well, you've done quite a bit for a long time. So,
thank you.
Yeah, there it is.
I feel like I should have you introduce me to more people. I might just take that recording and play that in front of things.
There you go. Well, the listener should know, and we have it in the show notes. You have your own YouTube channel, and you have tons of training videos and whatnot.
I sure do.
You are nonstop. But before we get into that, for the new listeners who didn't hear your last episode,
of course,
like to ask our guests, to a little bit of introduction. What is it about? So we're in custom software, but what is it about databases in SQL Server that just fascinates you, where you just love, focusing on that?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, really, it's sort of that like everyone has a database and almost no one knows how to use it. So for me, like just like understanding this thing that is just so vexing and troublesome for so many other people is just, I don't know, it's just really enjoyable because like you watch people just try to do stuff and get endlessly frustrated. Why doesn't this work? What is this error message? like how come none of this is right? And then you just like can spot just, a few things and get them on their way. And it's, I don't know, to me, that's very gratifying.
Yeah.
In a different life, maybe I would have been like helping people with their golf swing or something equally vexing.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I can attest to that. Well, you have so many videos on T-SQL in general, and you help databases move faster, and there's so many bad ways that you can screw up, T-SQL and then a database doesn't work properly or a query doesn't. So if we were just to raise it up, there's a lot of developers out there who maybe they've seen T-SQL, but they couldn't sit down with Notepad and just, author any kind of complex query from scratch. That skill just hasn't happened. So if we could just start with the architecture and how does it work? Because C# is different, right?
That's true.
I mean, your YouTube video has so many deep, like memory grants and how to work with views and like the indexed view serializable locking, like so many very specific things to think about. But if we broaden it out for all the people who are coming into the industry, what is the architecture of T-SQL and what do they need to know? How do they need to think about it just to begin with?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first ground rule of writing T-SQL is anything that makes your job easier makes the optimizer's job harder. There are lots of tiny little conveniences that you might indulge in when you're writing a query that will come back and bite you later. Like Microsoft, in their documentation for all of the sort of built-in functions and whatnot, is null, coalesce, substring, all that stuff. What they never sort of make plain and clear is that those are presentation layer functions. They have no meaning at all to the optimizer. And so, like probably the most common thing that I see new developers do is like, oh, this column is nullable. I don't want to deal with nulls. If I'm using C#, nulls throw errors. Do databases throw errors? I don't know. What do databases do with nulls? And so they just start wrapping various where clause and join clause elements and like stuff like isNull or coalesce. And they just have no idea that it's dragging their queries down and doing all sorts of terrible things. That is assuming that they're writing the SQL and that, like, it's not they're not going through an abstraction layer like Entity Framework or any of the other various tools out there that sort of hide the SQL from you.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of those out there. I mean, the default way to write a .NET application is using Entity Framework.
Yeah, Entity Framework.
Right. So if it's a very small application and a very small database, is it safe to say, yeah, anything works, no big deal? But then when the database gets massive, now it's a big deal?
Right. I mean, any sort of, trivial CRUD app that is just, hitting a few hundred, maybe a few thousand rows, you can get away with murder in those things. It almost doesn't matter. But, it's as soon as the data sort of gets to a meaningful size or a meaningful level of busyness, that's when all the shortcuts and conveniences tend to start, creeping up on you and causing problems. That's, and that's generally when I get called in. It's like, we've been doing things wrong for 10, 15 years or something. And now everything's wrong. Please help. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
If I don't have a time machine, but I can at least maybe alter the present a little bit.
Well, getting to the structure of T-SQL, I mean, it's a code file, but with C#, we're used to, okay, line 1, then line 2, then line 3, then we might be jumping over and calling a function, but T-SQL is not like that. So how does T-SQL execute?
Right. So there are two ways to answer this. One of them is probably the easier path in, which is that queries are really descriptions of what you want to see. You shape the results. You tell SQL, or you tell the database list. It doesn't have to be SQL Server. We can be database agnostic here for the most part. You tell the database which columns you want to see. That's your select list. You tell them where those columns live in your from and join clauses. You tell them which rows you don't want to see via the where clause or something like that. And then you have various ways of shaping the results further, either telling the database which rows you'd like to summarize with group by, and then what order you would like to see the data in via the order by clause. That's probably the easiest way, is queries are just descriptions of what you want to see. You pass that description to the database, and the database goes and tries to figure out some clever way of giving you that result, right? Answering your question. The other thing, more technical way of answering that, is that the way that you write your queries is not necessarily the order in which the database processes your queries, which can often lead to a lot of confusion in what you are allowed and not allowed to do and the way that you have to structure some queries. Just, for example, like SQL Server does not have the qualify clause in it. The qualify clause is kind of a neat thing that some other database engines have, where expressions that you compute in the select list, or even a net new expression, can be referenced immediately via the qualify clause. It's sort of sitting somewhere between like the where clause and a having clause almost. But that's a really powerful thing that you can do a lot of sort of interesting things with, but SQL Server doesn't have it. So certain things, like if you want to filter on a window function to say where like row number equals 1, you have to nest that query. Which brings it to the sort of the next interesting point about SQL, is that all of the query results can be thought of as tabular. Maybe not like a physical table, right? It's not like every query that you write produces a table in the database, but it produces a tabular result, and those tabular results can be referenced in various ways via like inner and outer scopes and nesting and things like that. Before we get too carried away and start talking about other things, that's probably a good stopping point.
Yeah. Well, what's stuck with me is you're right. We select column name, but it's almost like in my mind, I'm having to think, no. From these tables, like that's what I have to think about first. Like, okay, then I figured out what to join, what's available. Now I can do select.
Right. And technically, that is the way that the engine executes your query as well. Select is one of the last things that gets really done, like the project of a query. If you're into relational algebra and the funny little symbols and letters, select is really a project. So, there are a lot of sort of takes on SQL that do either allow or use the from first syntax because to some people that does feel more natural. I don't really have a big feeling on that either way. I think, if it's more natural for you to write from and some tables and joins and whatnot, and then fill in your select list last in the query, just have like a placeholder, a select star or something. Don't leave it in there, but just a placeholder, then that's fine with me. But you would be more aligned with how the database engine is actually executing a query, where it's from and on and then where and then group by and all the other stuff. And select and then order by.
Well, so you mentioned any framework, and so many developers are just having the SQL generated. And that team works really hard to try to say, okay, for all the different ways, let's generally try to not do the obviously stupid things and just not have generated SQL that's terrible. But you can't, if the code isn't built for the shape of the database and the scale of the database, there's really no way of knowing. From an inspection perspective, when even before a client knows they're having performance problems somewhere, maybe they're running in Azure SQL and they just keep on bumping up the size of their Azure SQL. It's like, well, we need more horsepower. Database is running great as long as we have enough horsepower, right? And so how do you go in there and say, wait a minute?
Because I'm a lot cheaper than bumping up Azure every month.
Right. So is there like a set list of things that people could check, or even put it in their, continuous integration and inspection or static analyzers that could just prevent them from having to unnecessarily increase the size of their Azure SQL instance?
Yeah, so there is sort of so it's more of like a T-SQL smell thing. It's not guaranteed to solve like performance problems for you, but it's sort of a good analyzer. A friend of mine, Erik EJ, it's Eric and then another E like Eric and then a J like Jeffrey.
Okay.
He had he does a lot of work in the .NET C# ecosystem, and he has a T-SQL analyzer. I've helped him like review stuff on it, new rules and things. So it'll go through and it'll look at all that stuff, and it will help you figure out if the T-SQL that you've written is good, bad, ugly, or somewhere in between, maybe a mix of the three. But there's lots of sort of good stuff in there that will help, to say the uninitiated, with figuring out if the code that they've written is appropriate or not. I was reviewing an issue this morning for them. So it's fresh in my mind, but that's the first thing I usually point people to when, if they're looking for sort of a static code analysis. But there's a big difference between static code analysis and actual like performance analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, one example, you have a very small database. You can write the query any way you want it. As long as the results are correct, the performance is not going to change too much. Likewise, if you have like a big, gigantic database, you might have a query written in the ugliest way possible that somehow the optimizer has miraculously figured out a way to run pretty quickly. So there's a big difference between looking at a query and saying you have everything wrong with you, you don't stand a chance, and actually looking at the execution plan, getting like resource metrics for the query, analyzing all that stuff and figuring out what you need to change in order to make that query faster. Well, the static code analysis is a great thing, and it's a good starting place for absolutely anyone, because you shouldn't let the stinks and smells into your code. Something that the talk that I have to have a lot with people is, especially with SQL, which is not something that a lot of people invest themselves deeply in, the code becomes company culture very, very quickly. And if you start letting anti-patterns into your SQL in one place, those patterns are going to get copied and pasted every other place. So every time someone takes a shortcut, makes a mistake, it's like they're just sitting there sweating, trying to get something to work. They finally get it to work. It might not be the best way of doing things, but they got it to work. That's going to get copied and pasted and repeated everywhere. And so if you can start weeding that stuff out, even if it's not going to make the biggest performance difference for the query that it's changing in, just having that better like code culture for people to pass along and, go down through the generations of commits and pull requests and stuff, that is very valuable to have.
Yeah. Well, you make a good point. The code gets in there, and then we all naturally try to be chameleon coders, especially if we're new in the code base and we're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I get it to work here? Well, it's done like this. Let me just do it that way.
Yeah.
That just happens.
Yep. Well, it's like, every query hits this giant view that someone made 15 years ago. Let's just keep hitting it because it works. What else are we going to do?
Yeah. It works on my box, and Work them all the while. We're spending twice as much on the size of the database than we might have to.
Yeah.
We think it's like no table is over 1 million records. Why is it costing us this much?
Because everything hits this view that joins every table that's 1 million records together, and it's all like 28 left joins across all of them for every query that runs. And you're like, well, bad news.
Well, with the AI tools, it's the same thing. It sees a pattern in a code base and it matches the pattern, and then it does it more. And so kind of pulling in the equation of, well, T-SQL is a type of code, and if we need that type of code in a particular code base, well, now an AI tool is authoring it. Just starting from the beginning, what have you seen in this era? So many people are talking about C# and TypeScript and all these other types, but what have you seen from how deeply are you using the AI tools for your work as well?
Okay, so there's a lot to answer there.
Yep.
To me, AI and the LLM. Well, let's be real. The LLMs, right? We don't have the AIs.
Sure,
yet. We have the LLMs, right? They are ruthlessly logical, but they are not clever. Right? They can spot logical issues with things, but they are not clever about fixing things. Any fix that they make is going to be like the most like logical thing that they can do.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like like the difference between like someone sitting down at a piano and playing like whatever, like they can play whatever note you tell them to play, but if you ask them to play a song, they couldn't do it, right? It's just like a different thing. Like they might technically know where every key and what every chord is, but they can't put them together in like a nice way that makes a nice melody that people want to hear. But to me, it's just another abstraction layer, right? SQL, like databases have always had abstraction layers. We had views, we had functions back in just inside the database, and then we got abstraction layers that were, sort of like the entity framework and then Hibernate, like we were talking about. But to me, AI is just another abstraction layer for people to sort of get away with not having to fully know something. What I found with using them is in the beginning, I was absolutely holding them wrong. I would sit down with this thing and I was like, all right, you're going to take my job. Let's talk about it. So I would try to have these like expert level conversations with them about SQL Server, which the thing I know the best. And it was just, to this day, it's not great. There's like a lot of problems. There were like a couple weeks ago, the VP of some company sent me this document about 2 features that they wanted to use simultaneously that the robots were like, you can't use these simultaneously. And it's 17 pages long. And I read the first paragraph. I'm like, the whole thing is wrong, right? That doesn't exist. You can use both of those just fine together. And so I was just like, I can save you a lot of time on this. The robots are full of malarkey. So that's my continuing sort of experience with them is having them try to operate at sort of an expert level doesn't go well. But how I have learned to work sort of peaceably with them is if I have a query that I know how I want to rewrite and what I want that rewrite to be, I can tell them exactly what I want to be done to it, and they can handle that. And that's great for like big pieces of work that would just are like annoying and arduous for a human being to have to do. Like restructuring a big long query is dynamic SQL. It might not be bang on perfect the first time, but it's going to get you a lot closer, a lot faster than you would get, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how I've sort of learned to work with them is to the line that usually gets spun around with this is like keep a human in the loop, right? And I absolutely agree with that. But the human should not be in the middle of the loop. The human should be like at the top of the loop, and the loop should just keep coming back to the human. So the first experiences were like, hey, can you write a query that does this? Sure. Copy and paste it into like SSMS, try to run it, get an error, like results are wrong, go back and be like, hey, here's like a copy and paste of the results. These results aren't right. Or like, here's a like copy of the error. LLM goes, oh, okay, well, errors, wrong results. Go fix it, right? And so like it's just like a lot of back and forth, and you're sitting there and you're an impediment. So what I've started doing is like I just give the LLM access to SQL CMD. It's a command line thing. Yeah. I let them connect into my local VMs and I let them run the query until stuff is right, and like they work out the kinks and the errors, and then they come back to me with this thing, and I'm like, cool, you've produced something here. But like I still stay in the loop, and I'm like, well, maybe that's not the best way to write the query, but this is stuff that you have to know in order to sort of push back on. If you don't know, you're kind of just like, cool, well, you say it's right, and you ran it, and there's no errors, and the results seem okay, so we can go with that. But like my sort of place with them is sort of like, I'm going to let you do this stuff, but what you come back to me with is that's the thing that I have to sort of finally review and have the final say on.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, having tool access to CMD in an environment with a representative database, because if there's no ability to actually run it in any sort of environment, then it's just, well, we did some pattern matching and I think this might work, but who knows? Because until you run it, you don't know if it'll even function, or if there's a syntax error hiding somewhere.
Oh, and look, the hallucinations are real. Like to this day, so every once in a while, you can still catch them slipping on stuff. Like, hey, I need to restore a table in SQL Server, and they're like, oh, well, here's your restore command, and then you're like, you can't restore a table in T-SQL, man. I'm sorry. I was just messing with you. But you failed. But it's cool. Maybe you'll learn from this. I don't know. But just like even like DMV queries, they have infinite access to like the web now. Remember early LLM stuff? They couldn't go search the internet for things, but now it's like web search tools. Great.
Yeah.
You can go look at the docs. You can go look at everything that you need to look at, and they will still screw up just like basic DMV queries, either hallucinate the DMVs themselves, column names, they'll get the data types all wrong. And you're like, you could just go look at this. Why do you trouble me with these things?
Well, speaking about looking up documentation in context.
Yeah. Humans aren't good at that either.
Well, there's some ideas that I've kind of heard. I want to get your take on it about taking the tribal knowledge of why is this column here and what is this table for, and are these three columns related? There's schema documentation that people may or may not have, but it's really just learning. But then there's description fields of every table and comment in the schema metadata, and actually taking that and like inserting it into the schema so that the AI tools kind of naturally read more information about what to think of or what to reason about a column. Is that, do you think that's useful, or what do you think about that?
I do think it's useful, but it's still one of those things where like the LLM has to be paying attention to that, and it has to be mindful of that, and it has to remember that in the context window that you're working in. So there's a lot that can go wrong in that space. Like to this day, like all the advice you read about working with LLMs, it's like you got to have guardrails. I'm like, okay, cool. So like you make your guardrails files, and you make your skills, and you make all this other stuff. And you still can't rely on the LLM of maybe carefully following those or paying attention to those. Sometimes it's like, sorry, I just didn't look at that first, or I forgot, or like I shouldn't have done that. You're just like, okay, well, but it was there. Why aren't the guardrails working? And so like there can still be very frustrating things that happen no matter how much documentation and no matter how much work you put into making that stuff obvious for them. I think one very good constraint and one very good source of forcing the knowledge onto an LLM is via MCP servers and MCP tooling. So like if you have a tool that allows them to read from a thing and they need to know what that thing is reading from, there's a lot of documentation that can go into that. So when they read from that thing, it makes it makes more sense. They're able to reason better about the results that they're getting, like why things might look good or bad or strange and stuff like that. I think that's a valuable way of giving them access to data and giving them information about the data that they're accessing that is sort of unavoidable.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned guardrails.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking just so many situations where whether or not the guardrail is just a paragraph, everything's a paragraph, right? A sentence. In the case of the famous Pocket OS database dropped, including all backup situation, the guardrail was do not do anything destructive. And then this thing is a language processor pattern matching algorithm.
Right.
There's no understanding of the definition of the term destructive. And so it might just be executing a tool call. It's not deleting any code or destructive. It's just calling a tool. The tool happened to have dropped the production database.
Surprise.
So the concept of a guardrail, I can't get my head around it because it seems incompatible with the architecture of an LLM.
Yeah, but everyone insists that you need to have them, and I just find that the more guardrails I have, the more guardrails get ignored. It's like having a teenager. You're like, hey, be home by 10 o'clock, and then 10:30 rolls around, and they're like, hey, I'm back, and you're like, well, I told you 10. And they're like, yeah, but I had to get I forgot. Oh, I didn't look at my phone. I didn't look at my watch or whatever. And you're like,
yeah.
Well,
it's almost like
I can't change that now.
It's almost like from an architecture perspective, the concept of a guardrail has to be implemented using a deterministic technology instead of an interpreted or language technology. Like having a personal access token that literally only has read access to the server. Okay, that's a guardrail. That's an actual guardrail. You can't write. It can only read.
Right. I think the problem is that, it reminds me of like any sort of general security thing, like the number of databases that still get found out on the internet that are not password protected, right? Why are they like that? Well, the developer had to get something working. What was the fastest way to get it working? Well, screw security, right? Safety fourth, right? So like a lot of the stuff that people and a lot of the reason why people end up in trouble with LLMs doing destructive things is because they in order to get the work done quickly, they need to give the LLM a lot of access to a lot of stuff so that the LLM can function without being like, oh, well, now you need to do this part. And you're like, I can't do that part. You have to do that part. Screw it. Give the pat right at, give admin, whatever. And like you just keep expanding there, or unless you just give them the whole kit and caboodle to start. No, people just keep allowing more and more, because the more that they allow them to do, the faster that stuff gets done. But then obviously you end up hitting a wall or a drop database.
And then you never take it away.
Yeah, and then you're like, well, now you're grounded, young man. Like, well, it's too late. The company's dead.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing where you have to have those sort of physical boundaries on things, but how you implement them, people tend to get lax or flexible with stuff, and then that's when they get bitten on things.
Yeah. Well, let's get tactical, kind of the tail end here. Now we talked about kind of your philosophy and how to think about these things. What AI tools do you find yourself using yourself?
Yeah, good question. So we are a Claude household. I use Claude Code for just about everything that I have to do. I got the max plan so I can burn tokens and rainforests and all the rest of it. I use ChatGPT for image generation only because Claude doesn't really do that, and ChatGPT is still kind of off the rails enough with some things. Mm-hmm. You get some pretty funny pictures out of it. It's maybe not exactly what you want or what you're after, but you're like, oh, that's funny anyway. But yeah, I find I'm just going to say I have the best luck with Claude. I've tried various other tools and not had the same level of success with them. But, I think one of the sort of keys to using LLMs is to use them is sort of enablers for yourself. So just like my example that I use now is I built a database monitoring tool. Would I have built a database monitoring tool if I didn't know a lot about databases? Probably not. But I know a lot about databases. I know what I want to collect. I know where I want to put it. I know how I want it to look when it gets shown to people. What I don't know is front-end stuff. I don't know XAML. I don't know C#. I don't know, WPF. And there was just never a chance of me learning all that stuff. Yeah. But the robots will work whenever I want them to work. Whenever I get an idea or I get a thought in my head, I can put them to work on that. They'll write the code that goes over the thing that I know really well. And I think that's a good way to use them. If you were just doing something that you have net zero knowledge of, and you're like, I want to do this thing today, that might not go as well as if you sort of use them to build up around things that you already know reasonably well, things that you would just never do if you didn't have this helper to do it. And again, I know that nothing that I build is perfect. I know that nothing that I build is bug-free or, issue-free or any of that stuff, but it wouldn't exist if I didn't have this thing. And I'd rather have something imperfect in the world than just continue to have an empty pipe dream that just never comes to be.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. You have enough architectural knowledge to understand that if you reach for WPF, it's going to run on a process on your computer rather than in a web browser. And so you understand the architectural boundaries of it, and then you just let the robot fill in the syntax.
Yeah, just fill in the syntax, make the how do you make a chart or a graph in WPF? Oh, goes and looks at stuff. Oh, Scott plot's pretty good. Let's use that. And then it just and then it can figure out how to use Scott plot in that context. And you're like, for me doing that. Never mind anything that complicated. I remember just when I had to use PowerShell on my own, it's like, okay, well, here's some PowerShell. Run it, get an error. 5-10 minutes of Googling the error. Is this right? Is this the change I need to make? What is? I don't know. Just endless back and forth and trying. And the robots just bang through this stuff so quickly. Again, none of it's perfect, but some stuff that I do was terribly imperfect too. I am not a software developer by trade. I am not a PowerShell writer by trade. So it's just expect human imperfection from this stuff. It's not going to be Windows still gets bug patches and security stuff. So of course something that you start building 2 weeks ago is going to have problems.
Well, I just want to celebrate for a little bit because to be an 18-year-old programmer in this era, what an amazing. I mean, okay, I don't know what version was it, Sybase or SQL Server in 1997, whatever version it was, but whether it was that or whether it was just a UI control, it's you change one property or change one line and tweak the where clause, then you run it. Okay, did that work? Then you tweak something, run it again. Tweak something, run it again.
Yep.
I mean, an entire morning of just like you mentioned, Scott plot for that. You would change one property of how to configure that graph control and then run it, and then you look up some documentation, change another property, and that would be 4 hours go by.
Yeah.
And now it's just a 1 minute or 2 minute AI interaction, and then you got something that you like.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, I think. I'm not going to say that AI has really corrected this fully. Because sometimes the AI has to try a bunch of different stuff. But I remember just the days, writing any of my analysis store procedures, where I'm trying to parse out XML from some source in SQL Server. And I would get 5, 10, 20 tweaks into a query, finally get something working. And I'm not sure if it's one tweak or a combination of tweaks that made it work. And so all the tweaks stay in, and it's I just don't know anymore. And the robots make sort of figuring out which thing worked the easiest. Another thing that I find them invaluable for is, when I release the store procedure stuff, they have to work from 2016 now to 2025 because I try to set a reasonable boundary on what I'm going to support. But I was always terrible at testing across all the different versions and all the different parameter permutations, whereas the robots don't get bored or forget or this sucks. I don't want to do this. But I can just send them off in that. They'll run against all my VMs. They'll try 100 different parameter combinations. If there's an error, they'll go fix it. It's it takes a lot of the arduous stuff out of the work that I have to do. I can focus more on the bigger picture stuff while they do their little tweaky things.
Yeah.
Their testy things. Testing is cool. You just have to make sure that they're writing adversarial tests and not happy path tests, because they're really keen on writing happy path tests to make sure the code works. But you have to kind of ask them to be bullies if you want to make sure that your code works. When it hits weird stuff.
Yeah. Well, have you found that? Before I ask that, okay, you mentioned using Claude.
Yeah.
What models do you find yourself using Claude with?
I usually just stick with whatever is the latest. I went from Opus 4.6 to 4.7. I read a lot of stuff about people having very different sort of experiences with them. For me, it hasn't really been all that weird or different. It hasn't changed. It's gotten, I think, better, but it hasn't changed. I haven't had one of those days where it's just hit my 1 million token limit in 3 minutes. That's just never happened for me. Maybe I'm okay at using them. I don't know. Maybe I should become an AI enabler for people. But I don't run into the things that I hear a lot of people complaining about, oh, it's slow and dumb. It's like 4.0 levels of stupid now. And I'm I just don't run into that.
Nice. Okay. And then you mentioned tests. Do you find that it makes tests that are worth keeping?
Well, before I didn't have any tests. It was just sort of the test was you hit F5, and if you got an error message, then it was something was broken. But now it's like you can test stuff a little bit better. They're much better at setting up smaller portions of the code. Like stored procedures, especially big long ones, are absolutely just nightmare to like test small portions of. You're like, oh, the variables get declared up here. Oh, there's a temp table I need down here. Oh, there's another query that has to run to populate the variables down here. So like you end up with this whole like steps of things that you have to run through. The robots have no problem just like cherry picking with the parts that you need and then going from there. So it's like I have tests now, which is so much better than before. I love that I have some tests for things. So like I am not a software developer by trade, so I could not tell you if my unit testing is substandard or outstanding or somewhere in the middle. But just having something that I can look at and say it passed these series of validations, I've gotten a little bit better about that, because when I realized that all of the tests it was creating was very happy path testing, there was no adversarial testing going on. There wasn't like, no, I want you to try to break this. I don't want you to just tell me that it works. I want you to like try to functionally break this behavior. So like that's something that I've had to get better at and make sure happens every time tests are getting written.
Well, as we close up here, do you have any speaking engagements, or do you want to point the listeners to anything? Of course, your YouTube channel will include in the show notes. But how can they learn more about you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I of course have all the stock and standard internet offerings. I have a website, erikdarling.com. I am on Twitter, LinkedIn. I am on what's the other one? Blue Sky. The one thing that you should keep in mind with this stuff, though, is that I am Erik with a K, like the Viking. So if you Google Erik with a C, Darling, you might find someone completely different in the world who you might fall in love with, get married to, have kids. Will not be me. You will not learn a thing about SQL from them, most likely. Also, they're going to be a sociopath because their parents spelled their name wrong.
All right. Awesome. We'll include a link to all that in the show notes. And yeah, thanks for coming back on the show and
of course, anytime.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Always happy to be on here. Thank you, Jeff.
Fantastic. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the AI DevOps podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and everywhere else. Visit our sponsor, ClearMeasure, at clearmeasure.com. And on behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.